Welcome to week 2 of the Spirituality of Caregiving class. We were more than capably led last week by our own director of the Center for Life and Learning, Annette Molesky. And today we are joined by Nancy Benson-Nicole and Amy Pagliarella. So we are once again in excellent hands. My name is Polly Peters. It's good to see all your faces again. I'm sorry I had a miss last week. I'm the co-chair of the Adult Ed Council here at Fourth, and my co-chair is Ted Otto, who was your host last week, just FYI. So we have one more week next week, which will be led by our own member, Jeannie Forrest, and then the following week, we will kick off another 3 weeks of the history of Presbyterianism to be led by Ken Sawyer of McCormick. So we look forward to seeing you there. Let us begin with prayer. Oh, Holy One, we thank you for this day, this community, and the opportunity to care for and receive care from others. And let us view it as just that, an opportunity to deepen our connection with others and by extension with you, dear God. Help us recognize the fear and uncertainty on the part of both the care recipient and the caregiver, while guiding us towards the realization of the gifts that we provide to one another. As caregivers particularly, may we never be without kindness, care, and love, so we may come to inherit these qualities when darkness and suffering enter our own lives. We trust in our ability to do so with your grace, and we pray in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, without further ado, here's Nancy. By the way, our whole schedule is on the back of these handouts, which can be found on the table in the back. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Polly and Ted, and to the Adult Education Council. Thank you so much for allowing us to spend time to journey a bit into the nature and of the spirituality of caregiving. I bring greetings on behalf of Jeannie Forrest, who is in California, suffering in the California sunshine. So she'll find her way back here next Sunday. And greetings from Annette Molesky, my colleague in the Center for Life and Learning, who was masterful in initiating our reflection. And so I want us to just be reminded of the definition from Henry Nouwen's work that she lifted up for us to define and center our understanding and approach to the concept of caregiving, which caregiving is about forming a relationship with one another whom we might never have chosen to know. It is about doing all we do practically with the intention of growing into a relationship of respect, listening, presence, and truthfulness. And as we acknowledged in the morning worship service, the blessing of the volunteers, and I see a bevy of faces of volunteers here in the room, and I'm sure joining us online as well. You know how you have the opportunity to encounter and be of mutual blessing among those who you may have had no other reason to meet but for this space in the community. My thoughts and reflections today are actually going to pivot in the opposite direction, which is the situations of care among people that we know very deeply, or perhaps too deeply in some instances. My reflection is going to be the first half of this class. So here's where we're going today. We're going to take about the first half hour to consider the multi-generational aspects and realities of caregiving, and specifically looking at the generations known as the sandwich generation, but of what that means and what are the particular challenges and areas of promise related to being in the situation of sandwich as it relates to care. And then Pastor Amy, my esteemed colleague, parish associate for Caring Ministries, will initiate the conversation about aspects of caregiving unique to older adults. And then from that will be the bridge into next week with Jeannie lifting up particular issues centered in dementia care. So this is our roadmap moving forward. But before we dig into statistics and figures, I want to share a little bit of personal experience. Uh, I was born into a family of caregivers. And I'll just walk you through. Um, in the center image, this was one of those. Does anybody, side note, remember the good old days of Owen Mills church photography? Yes, there is a lovely representation of Olin Mills photography circa 1996. I was home from college for the summer, and we all slapped on our Sunday bests and got together for our Olin Mills photo. This center photo is my family of upbringing. I was raised by the lady in black in the center. That was my mother, Nanette Benson Nicole. To her left in the mustard was my grandmother, Gladys Nelson. You will also see Gladys leaning into the diagonal. So that is Gladys with little old me. And then there was Gladys in her heyday. She was an RN. She served in her profession as a school nurse. And actually, another side note, she helped to establish the first school-based polio vaccine clinic in the United States. Long may she rest. And to the right of my mother in the floral is my Aunt Nancy Nelson, who some of you may have met in September 2022. She was present during my installation service here. She lives in our hometown of Doylestown, Pennsylvania. So all of the family that's represented here is the maternal side of my family from Pennsylvania. The twins that are here happen to be Nanette and Nancy because they are fraternal twins. So that was them when they were little. That was them in their adulthood. And that picture in the corner was from Christmas 2017 with my mom and my aunt. That was the Christmas before my mother died, sadly, in April of 2018. In the top right-hand corner was my grandfather, Randall Nelson, who happened to be a DI in the Marine, a drill instructor in the Marines. When these were pictures that that my grandmother and grandfather exchanged with one another. I have other generations up here. Above, in the fancy fur, is my grandmother as a young adult. And in the center was my great-grandmother, Nancy Clemon, and then her sister, Fanny. And in the corner down below is another picture of Fanny with my uncle Charlie. All of the people who are pictured in this slide have received care by my mother and my aunt, and there are many more who are not on this slide. In fact, this cluster of family that is the central figure reflects the reality of a longstanding family conviction that there is always a place at home when you need it. And so when my father had met and married my father, when she moved to DC to embark on her young adulthood, she found, unfortunately, him not to be able to control his physical and emotional abuse. And knowing that she could always come home when she was expecting me, she left DC and returned to our family's homestead in Doylestown, where I was reared by my mother, by my Aunt Nancy, who never married and never left Doylestown, and by my grandmother. So this represents multi-generational family caregiving in its center. And the two on the side here were the sandwiches. But they cared for, and they had been sandwiches since they were 15 years old. Uh, in the early 60s, my grandfather fell ill with cancer. And a cancer diagnosis at that time had the same level of um, suspicion and distancing, isolation that HIV and AIDS had in the 80s. People were still learning how cancer developed. And so this was a very isolating time for them. Around the same time that my grandfather fell deeply ill with cancer, my grandmother had a massive heart attack. So my mom and my aunt, Nancy, they have an older sister, my Aunt Jeannie, who's not in the picture. Or who I don't have a slide up here because Jeannie was a bit older. She was married and she was away. And actually, Jean hadn't been involved in the family caregiving throughout the years, which may be a dynamic that you are aware of or have experienced. So the caregiving in the family fell to my mother and aunt, both immediate family and extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins. So they, as teenagers, were the primary caregivers for both my mom and my aunt. And then he passed away. My grandmother lived to her early 80s, and she died in 2003. And at that time, she had been receiving home-based hospice care. Then my mother and my aunt, round the clock, took care of her. This coincided when I was in between having finished a parish ministry residency as a younger adult and seeking what would be my call into a congregation past that experience. And at the time, I had begun conversations with a couple of different ministries, a few congregations and some chaplaincies, but I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to land. But conversation had been really promising with one particular church. And I had scheduled a time to go and visit that church. And my grandmother at that point had been in home hospice care for 10 months at that time. We like to joke that she had flunked hospice. um, and was growing more sickly and was near the end. And we weren't quite sure what was still keeping her here. She didn't know either. And this caregiving time was deeply profound for my mother in particular in deepening her relationship with my grandmother. My mother ended up writing some beautiful reflections about the mystical experiences related to being a caregiver at that time. But they had my grandmother and they had me trying to relaunch into my next call. And it was worrisome, tiring physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. My mom and my aunt and even my grandmother were spent. And as I was getting ready to fly out for the interview with a particular congregation, my mom and my aunt had said to me, Nancy, if they call you when you're out there, do you think that you'll say yes? Can you say yes? So that because we think that she is hanging on so that she knows that you have, some place to land. And so the active care and how, the multifaceted ways in which the weight of expectations of care carry on are a part of being in the multi-generational context in which caregiving happens. So, the sandwich generation, and I have picked this image purposefully. I could have picked a hoagie or a club sandwich, but I have the grilled cheese for a reason that you'll know in just a second. But Merriam-Webster defines the sandwich generation as a generation of people who are caring for their aging parents while supporting their own children. And that's a very basic definition, but there are a variety of configurations related to being the sandwich generation. Now, the concept of the sandwich generation was introduced to the fields of social work and to gerontology by two scholars, respectively, Dorothy Miller in gerontology and Elaine Brody. Elaine Brody in gerontology and Dorothy Miller in social work, respectively, around 1981. And the generational cohort of sandwich generation can and does shift. Initially, it described the situation of women who were facing their 20s and their 30s, who, on the one hand, were caring for families and their small children, and then, on the other hand, caring for aging parents. And then, as life spans have increased and the reality of multi-generational family networks have grown and shrunken over the decades. We know of sandwich generations being the reality for people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and some below as well. So it's a shifting definition related to generational cohort. And it also encompasses a variety of other demographics. Men and women find themselves in the sandwich generation. At the same time, the predominant model of who is a part of the sandwich tends to be women. And initially, when the phenomenon was described, it was focused on women and then expanded in its reality. It tends to be that male caregivers, primary source of caregiving, with exception, but generally speaking, tends to be financial support across generations, whereas physical and emotional support tends to be the sphere of women, as is common with societal expectations for women's roles in the family. Another scholar, Carol Abaya, goes on to further describe various realities of or different types of sandwiches in the sandwich generation. She identifies the traditional sandwich generation as those who are caregiving in between aging parents who need care and help and children of their own. Just described the primary model. She describes a club sandwich, which are those in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, sandwiched between adult children, aging parents, adult children, and grandchildren, or those in their 20s and 30s and 40s with young children, aging parents, and grandparents. Anybody venture guess as to why it's a club sandwich? Exactly, the many layers that are involved. And then who wants to venture a guess at what another type of sandwich might be? That the true, indeed. Close. I think you meant to say open-faced. She describes the open-faced sandwich, which is anyone involved in elder care. So, these are the varieties of ways in which this being squeezed and stuck betwixt and between, and having to have multiple levels of consciousness and responsibility related to the extensions of caregiving moving forward. Now, there are particular pressures and possibilities that are related with the sandwich generation, and I want to use a little bit of a visual, if you'll permit me. There are pressures that come from above and pressures that come from below. If we are the individual here standing on our own, what might be some of the overhead pressures? Who might be the relationships we think generationally? Let's imagine that you are 49. Who might be people that you would be caring for when you're 49? Parents. Yes, yes. Absolutely. So, yes. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. My experience right now is thinking through the implications of my Aunt Nancy. It's the two of us remain. And my Aunt Nancy, actually, when my mother died, this is the first time in her entire life that she has lived by herself. And so she is, very active, and she is fiercely independent, and she is enjoying the freedom of being able to live on her own terms. And she has a very robust community, thank God, a robust community, but none of us are getting any younger. And so considerations related to what care looks like, especially from a distance, are on the plate in the sandwich. Um, so we can identify, the pressures of both who occupies this space, perhaps parents, grandparents, even in some cases. And then in the other direction, you've got children or nieces or nephews. And on the other side, aunts and uncles there. When we think of what might be overhead pressures, what tends to be due every month? Rent. Yes, the bills, the financial pressures that bear down upon us. What are the pressures that might be coming from underfoot, rising above? Children, the cost of daycare or caregiving for children. So financial burdens from above and below. Time might be another burden from above and below. Space considerations. So all of this pressure that contracts in that can make us feel like we are spilling out. No. So, you've got these, you've got these relationships that are pressing in two directions with their own sets of responsibilities. But what about when we consider this axis? What relationships need to still be maintained by many people, let's say on this side of the equation? Career, sure. Spouse, absolutely. Absolutely. So we may have career on that left-hand side and spouse on the other side. What else might be any other siblings? Yes. Health issues, yes, in terms of what else are, of impact, health issues, friendship relationships, all threaten to be compromised given how constricted and compounding all of these things are. So where, in the midst of all of this pressure and strain facing people who are in the sandwich generation, which for the reasons cited of all of the pressures can breed a sense of isolation and loneliness and disconnection, where are we to find hope? I love to use this image in so many different ways because it really does center in the heart of this. We are gathered here this morning as Christians in celebration of Christ. We are both pressed in and we find ourselves at the same time stretched. So I find the cross to be an apt metaphor for the experience of being a caregiver in the sandwich generation. But when we look to the heart, to the intersection of all these things, all these poles can feel very overwhelming. But if we find our center, we can find our center and find who might be also there in the center. God, yes. Christ is at the center, and Christ's beating heart can provide the source of inspiration and hope and sustenance in the midst of what we suffer, because we serve a God who not only knows the resurrection, but who experienced the crucifixion. So, at whatever stage in which we find ourselves, we're not alone, but we find our center and strength in the Lord. There are two, as I wrap up here, there are a verse and a poem that I would like to share. The verse comes from Matthew. It's chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. These may be familiar words to you. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I am going to shorten the conversational piece so as to allow ample time for Amy to share the next portion of our time together. But as this question appears on the screen, I invite you to think about it as I share another source of potential comfort and inspiration, and there are so many. And I would encourage us as we continue to contemplate beyond this space to share with one another if you found yourselves as a part of a sandwich generation or whatever wisdom you may have found in either giving or receiving care, to share those resources. But there's a poem by our own Mary Lennox, who joins us from a distance from California, living in California now, but had been a part of our circle of caring community as a deacon here at Fourth. Mary, every Sunday, sends the deacons some of her original work and their poems, and this one just so happened to come through, and I think identifies another source of sustenance. She calls it Monday's Turnaround. After a restless night of sleep, I woke up feeling unsettled. What's happening? I wondered. I turned within to begin my meditation, soon distracted by my chattering mind. Spirit whispered, rise, go see the sunrise. I did so. Then it came amid an aura of orange, that glorious sun beaming to earth, this bright star at the center of the solar system, faithfully giving life to life like none other, unconditionally, blessing us with light, energy, hope, and promise. I sang a song of gratitude for the sun, this wondrous, omnipresent gift. A change came over me as I received the gaze of this amazing miracle, refreshing my heart with joy, peace, and love, breath by breath. As near to us as our very breath, as bright and as sure as the sun. Sometimes it's the simplest of God's gifts that can give us just that one little bit of refreshment. Thanks be to God for that gift. One last thing that I want to leave you with as we transition into a deeper dive into caregiving among older adults. The sandwich generation issues will continue to be present with us and is a permanent reality for the dominant life of our nation. For the first time in history, 10 years from now, it's projected that older adults will outnumber children. Yes, this is and you'll have this in your slide packet, but it has not been since, well, in 2016, roughly 49.2% of people were adults 65 plus, and 73.6% were children under 18. By 2034, that number will be roughly equal, separated by a few percentage points. By the time we get to 2060, it will well, there'll be more older adults by a slim majority in 2030. That will skew precipitously by 2060, where there will be 94.7 million older adults, 65 plus, and 80.1 million children under 18. So, as the implications continue to impact areas of technology and medicine and how we live our lives, we'll begin to see how society is or is not positioned to respond and to equip people who have multiple responsibilities for caregiving across generations. Thank you for allowing me to reflect a little bit about this reality. And so now I'll turn it over to Amy.
Nancy, thank you. And folks, don't worry, we'll have some time at the end for questions and conversation all together. But I want to encourage us to think a little bit about specifically older adults. It's a great thing older adults are so awesome because we're finding out there are going to be more and more older adults to enjoy in the future. But as I was listening to Nancy, I was remembering when I had young children, when I had infants, and life was just so nuts. And the idea of somehow being able to tend to my own spiritual needs, the idea that somehow I would find the energy at the end of the day to, spend hours in prayer and meditation and reading my Bible and doing all of these things. And it just simply was not realistic. That was not going to happen. And I think that the same is true when we are a caregiver. The idea, one of the first things that caregivers sort of sacrifice can be the practices and the things that nurture ourselves and speak to ourselves. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about how that's not inevitable, right? When we are caregivers, we can do the things that nurture ourselves. We need to do the things that care for ourselves. But how can we do that in a way that's realistic and sort of integrated into the very real experiences of being a caregiver? And so to get us started on that, I'm going to encourage us to think of this other quote from Henry Nouwen. And he says, "Because we who offer care and we who receive care are both strong and vulnerable. And so coming together is an occasion to open ourselves to receive an unexpected gift." So, how can we, through the very tasks and work and sometimes challenges of caregiving, how can we find some of the things that also speak to us and allow us to care for ourselves? I'm going to be realistic. It's not always easy. One of the older adults who I visit with frequently was sharing with me that his caregiver was particularly grumpy that day. And he was telling me this. Then he said, "Well, to be fair, it was the middle of the night and he had come in to wipe my bum. So I understand why he was maybe not very joyful in that moment." So let's be real, right? Let's put that out there. Sometimes the tasks of caregiving are not joyful. Sometimes they're really tough. And so, how do we find some joy in those moments? And, I think this is the beginning to understanding how we might do that, right? Um, how can we approach caregiving with a mutuality that says, I, the caregiver, am not the only one who comes in with something to give, right? If I'm coming in as a caregiver, there's a gift to be received. What is that gift? Can I open myself to it? Maybe I don't know what it is. And maybe days are going to go by that don't really feel like a gift. But by having this relationship with someone, I'm opening myself up to that. And then the same is true when we're the ones receiving care. Sometimes it can be awkward. I was visiting with someone the other day who was somebody who had a lot, very prestigious person who had a position of authority and influence. And all of a sudden, all of these people were coming to visit them, wanting to offer care. And it was really tough. And this person shared with me that they didn't always like being in the position to receive care. So, how can we be open to that? And I think in some ways, to go back to my reminder of what it was like to be with babies, let me be 100% clear. I am not equating infants and older adults in any way, shape, or form. But a lot of the work of caring for an infant is no fun at all. Right. And so, what do you do as a parent to avoid going insane? Or if you're caring, if you're a babysitter, if you're caring for nieces or nephews, if you're with children, what do you do? Well, you find rituals, you find little joyful exchanges that bring meaning to that. When I used to change my kids' diapers, I would make up little songs that we would sing to make a joyful ritual out of what could sometimes be a rather unpleasant task. Similarly, when we're with an older friend, whether it's a parent, a family member, friend, neighbor, whatever, we create rituals. We find ways of maybe slowing down and maybe being more attentive to the person who we're caring for, saying, what can I learn from the way that my friend or my parent is navigating the world? And can that be something that's a little gift to me as well? And I'm going to talk about how we engage with older adults and how all of those kinds of engagements can be a way of experiencing these gifts. And so I want to think about, I have a dear friend who I have been a kind of caregiver for a number of years now. And when COVID started, our relationship really shifted. I think that was actually the time that I understood myself more in a caregiving role for her, because very quickly her world shrunk. And she was very isolated. And so we had to get on Zoom pretty much every single day with a cup of tea or something stronger. And we were relating to each other in a way that we hadn't before, because the need was just so much more significant. And one of the things that she shared with me, she showed me over Zoom a card that a child from Fourth Church had made for her and had sent to her. And she said, well, I guess this makes me homebound, because I can imagine that the kids were told, we're making cards for the homebound. And we had a little bit of a chuckle over that. But it was a reminder that when we make a generalization like that, it's not always helpful. Now, we were thrilled that children at Fourth were making these cards. She was tickled. It was just a lovely, lovely thing. But it was also a reminder that, what are the messages that these children received? We didn't know. But we hoped that the messages they received were, we have older friends within the congregation. And even though we don't know them, and we know that they are so much more than homebound or isolated, we want to get to know them. And so this card is the beginning of a relationship with them. And that's one of the things that can happen in places like churches, right? Where different generations come together. It can be a place where people really are seen. And so I think that's the first thing about making sure, when we're caring for older adults, or we have older adults in our lives, is not just making this generalization. And so I've noticed now that we can go out and about, when I go places with my friend, I can tell that she really wants to be seen. She introduces herself to the waiters. She asks their names. She tries to make small talk. It usually does not go very well, because her voice is very low and the waiters have a hard time understanding her. And so they'll kind of just pretend that they understand and they'll kind of move along. And when I see this happen, I think, okay, this is a lesson for me, right? Maybe I need to change. Maybe I need to, though it would be great if a waiter paused, came down to her level, looked her in the eye, spoke slowly, said, I'm sorry, I missed that. Could you say it again? And modeled for her that maybe if she spoke a little bit more slowly and clearly, that we could have a real conversation. And this is where real relationships can happen. And so this reminds me that caregiving is a partnership. It's about making sure that people are included. And so sometimes in these kinds of interactions, we might think, if we're the caregiver, we might think that we're helping someone out if we speak for them or we try to hurry along. The transactions with the waiters can be a little awkward, I'm not going to lie. And so it's tempting to try to discourage it or speed it along. But instead, as a caregiver, I can I can try to bridge that gap, encourage those encounters, right? And I can encourage that we speak slowly. Oh, I don't think you heard my friend. Could you say that again? As opposed to saying, oh, my friend would like a coffee. Like there are ways that we rob people of agency instead of being advocates for their full inclusion. I think sometimes there are very legitimate barriers. There could be someone with, hearing loss, or maybe there are other reasons that they are moving slowly. Maybe there are mobility issues. And again, instead of putting ourselves in the position of trying to brush past those, we can say, okay, like what kind of accommodations would make this different, would make this better? The more I go out with my friend, the more easily I see the things that we can do to accommodate her walker. The places that are easier than others, right, in terms of parking and mobility and being able to come in and feel like she's not being stared at when we struggle to get seated or things like that. And so that's what we can do to make sure people are included. And then also older adults want to be seen as whole. And so like my thing in the beginning about the homebound, right? Anytime we kind of talk, we've realized in our world, like talking about the homeless is not very helpful, right? It's just a generalization. Similarly with older adults, she's not homebound, she's a full human. And what are the different ways that we can understand that? And this is something that's been helpful to me when I visit people in the hospital. Usually when I go to visit someone, my first question is like, how are you doing? How do you feel? What did the doctor say? Those are like logical ways to enter a conversation. But when someone is in the hospital, they want to again be seen as more than their condition, more than this medical problem to be solved. And so it's a really great way to just enter into a fuller conversation with someone. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but my final thing is ask, right? If we're viewing ourselves as in a partnership, to say, what do you need right now? What can I do to ease this situation? What can I do to help make connections? I mean, always asking someone what they want is a great way to ensure that they have full agency. But some of the ways that we can more deeply connect, I think first is about curiosity. And so, again, if I'm visiting someone in the hospital and I might start with like the basics, it's a great entry into like more tell me a story, right? Help me understand who you are. And I hear in my job, I hear so many great stories. I hear from people who, somebody who tells me that, she had her pilot's license in the 1930s, or someone who tells me, oh, the day that I was born, I almost died. And my grandmother kept me alive by feeding me coffee in a spoon because that's what the doctor said to do. I don't know if that's medically sound or not, but those are the great stories. And so being curious, inviting someone, and if it's awkward, you don't know a way in, I sometimes like, boy, things have really changed. The world's so different. I bet you've seen a lot. And usually somebody will just offer a story. But if not, I might, well, what was your earliest memory? Or if people are talking about church, because a lot of times people want to hear what's going on at Fourth Church, I might say, well, how did you find your way to Fourth Church? And next thing you know, they're talking about the job that brought them to Chicago, or the marriage, or the family. And then they're telling me about the church where they grew up. Oh, that sounds interesting. Tell me more about that church. What did you like? Were there songs that you loved? I mean, whatever it is, just being curious, asking questions. And then when you ask a question, I know sometimes silence is really awkward. So I might, start chattering. And I have discovered that silence is golden. Or even, mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Tell me more about that, right? Whatever you can do to not fill that silence, but to create space for people to share their stories. And before you know it, you know enough about someone that the second visit is easier because you have a starting point and you can deepen those relationships. And this might, I'm talking about this in a very general way, but think about this, if you're talking with a parent or an older grandparent, aunt, uncle, neighbor, even someone you've known a long time. I bet there's so much that they haven't told you about themselves. And so by asking some of those questions about growing up or, experiences that were formative, you're getting to know someone so much more deeply. And there's this wonderful word here, behold. Um, David Brooks wrote this great book, How to Know a Person. I highly recommend it. But he talks about a time that he looked at his wife and he beheld her and he saw something different in her that he had not really seen before. And so I love that word beholding. So take a moment to behold the person that you were with and to wonder about what it is that you might not know about them. Now, I'm making this all sound really lovely, but what if caregiving is difficult or painful, like these penguins who are arguing with each other because they have a terrible, terrible relationship? What do we do when we are called to be a caregiver for somebody who we maybe have had a lot of conflict with? Sometimes we suddenly find ourselves in it being asked to care for someone who was downright harmful or abusive to us. What do we do? How do we protect ourselves? And that's why I encourage us to think about that today. Or if you're already caring for someone where you have a tough relationship, to invite yourself to kind of take a step back. And I think what's really hard is that first, boundaries. It can be really hard to set boundaries. And what I find very difficult about it is I think there is just an inherent power imbalance sometimes in these relationships. And I don't mean power like in an ugly way, but it's just situational power, right? If you're caring for someone who is maybe limited in their mobility or their finances or their health, they're going to rely on you. And it can be more helpful to think about your boundaries in the beginning and then set boundaries than it is to kind of get to a place where you're feeling resentful or angry and then you have to kind of put the brakes. That can be much harder. And so what I have realized is that first, no is a full sentence. If someone asks me to do something that's not reasonable, it's fair to say no, can't do that. But it's also fair to be very clear for them. You know, I so look forward to visiting you on Friday, and I'm happy to bring you something from the store. Can't drop everything now and run it to you because you asked, but let me know what I can bring. And if you let me know by Wednesday, I will bring it on Friday. Whatever it is, better to do that than to get burnt out and then feel like you can't be in this mutual relationship. I think once you know your boundaries, you can also decide to break them. You might set boundaries in the beginning, but all of a sudden, maybe you're caring for someone who's suddenly bedridden, and you might decide, you know what, this is an appropriate time to set different boundaries. And I will visit you every day. I will drop everything to bring your favorite donut because you asked, and I'm going to do that because you just took a bad fall and you're in a tough spot, and that's okay. Those are the kinds of practical boundaries that caregivers sometimes need to set. There are also boundaries that are a little bit more awkward, right? And so some of these are sometimes we have an older adult who we're working with, and they might speak really harshly They might be hurtful. Sometimes that's part of a pattern. Sometimes it's a new thing. And we might have to adjust to the fact that someone we love very deeply is maybe struggling with dementia. Jeannie's going to talk more about that next week for sure, but sometimes that goes along with dementia. Or it might be sometimes people, as people get older, they have less social cognition. And so sometimes we talk about that as losing your filter. Doesn't happen with everyone, but it does happen. And so sometimes we are hearing things that are uncomfortable. And that's too where it's important to set a boundary. It might be as simple as saying, look, I love you, but right now I'm not able to listen to you speak that way about me or about my children or about cousin Ernie or whoever it is that we're hearing harsh words spoken about. Set that boundary. And then self-care. We got to be taking care of ourselves in all of that. And so, particularly as Nancy talked about the sandwich generation, if we're caring for a loved one and we know we have to go home and now parent our children, what's our strategy to make sure that we give ourselves some time to unwind in between those two encounters? Whether that's a podcast on the ride home, whether it's stopping for a latte, whether it's enlisting some help from a neighbor, whatever it is, making sure that we are taking care of ourselves. And those are some pretty simple strategies, but sometimes the strategies need to be a little bit more involving professionals, right? So it might be we need tangible professional help, and that's completely appropriate. We need to have somebody assisting our loved one with some of their basic needs so that we're able to come and give them the emotional care, but we are not overextending ourselves. It might be that we need to get care for ourselves. So if we're suddenly being asked to care for a family member who has really been harmful to us, if we haven't already processed that with the help of a therapist, this would be the time to do that. And this is where a trained therapist is important, right? A lot of times we get a lot of unasked for advice from ill-informed friends, and sometimes strangers. How could you put your mom in a home? That's terrible. No, thank you. I did not ask for your advice, friend. These are the kinds of things that people will say who don't know the situation, where you're like, no, I know my mom and I have researched this and I have met my needs. So that's not the kind of help I'm talking about. Or for ourselves, why are you looking at retirement homes? Surely your kids will let you move in with them. That might not be what you want, and that might not be what your kids want. So again, not the time to be entertaining advice from folks. It is the time though to be getting professional help, whether here at the counseling center, whether through talking with one of us or through a Stephen minister, through seeking a trained counselor or therapist. All of these are the kinds of resources that we're fortunate enough to have here in Chicago, so that we can be the best kind of caregivers and also be caring for ourselves at the same time. I want to give us a couple minutes to talk at our tables. And so what I'm going to do is invite you. Nancy gave us some food for thought earlier, reflecting a little bit on if sandwich generations relationships. You can certainly talk about that. You can also talk about experiences caring for an older adult or experiences receiving care. If that's the position that you're in right now and you want to talk with the folks at your table, we're just going to spend the last few minutes having those conversations. And Nancy and I will be available in case there's anybody who wants to speak with us personally. So I'm going to invite you to turn to the folks at your table. If your table's not real inclined to talk, find another table and and go for it. So much good conversation that I hate to do this. What I'm going to do is officially close us, and then people can stay and continue the conversations and can ask some questions. I'll stick around. Nancy's here. But thank you so much for this time. Thank you to Adult Ed. And I will just leave us with this final quote and say, let us go in peace and to serve and to care. Thank you, friends, for being here today.